welcome as our new president. So I have the great privilege to be introducing our.
So yeah, there's again
receiving
shameless
his name
plug
is
for
Rob
my book.
Mattson.
Kind of the genesis
About
of
a
it
year ago,
was,
Rob retired from
between
St. John's
2011 and
Management.
2015.
His position
It was
of
the
senior environmental
sesquicentennial, the
scientist.
150th
His
anniversary
field
of
expertise
the Civil War,
freshwater
1861,
springs
1865.
within the
And
St. John's River.
I was a
Water Management
contributing
Basin.
blogger to this website.
But he also
Civil
has
War
a presentation.
Sesquicentennial, and I largely
You might
posted
want to
actions
keep that
on.
in
This
mind
was actually an
sometime.
official U.S. Navy
He has
website
been
developed by the Naval History and Heritage Command.
involved
And
in
I
living
posted
history
mainly
interpretation
Florida
of Union
actions,
Navy
you know, on this date in 1863,
and more recently,
this happened on the St.
he has
John's
become
River, or this
World
happened
War
over Tampa Bay. That kind of
naval
thing. When I
reenactor.
was done, I had a
In
couple of
2014, he published a book entitled
papers,
The Civil
reports
War
I
in Florida,
acquired, notes
detailing naval actions
attending other
throughout the
meetings,
state
and I thought I want to
during
write
the
the
course
course
of
of
the
the
war.
war. So that was kind
Now,
of
I
the
purchased this
genesis
book
of it.
a couple of years ago, and I've read it twice. You can see I've
Start
got a
kind of
tab.
from the broad picture.
Very
When
interesting.
the war broke
And
out,
he has it
two
available
guys
for
in
purchase
charge of the Navy
for
on
$20,
the north,
either
Union
cash
Navy.
or
We had Gideon
check.
Wells, was
And with
President
that,
Lincoln's
please join me
secretary,
and welcome me,
Naval Secretary.
Rob Mattson.
A New Englander from Connecticut. He was one of the most loyal members of Lincoln's cabinet. He respected the president. He didn't covet the president's job. And Lincoln was very fond of him. For obvious reasons, he referred to him as Father Neptune. And then on the southern side, President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy appointed Stephen Russell Mallory his naval secretary, and that kind of gives a Florida connection. This is my second time down at Navy because he was a Floridian. Just for the war, he was one of our two United States senators. Some of y'all remember David Levy Unity down here in Florida next door in the library, and he had quite a bit of maritime experience. His background was in naval civil law, and he had served as chairman of the Senate Naval Affairs Committee. So he was very, very familiar. It's pretty much the story of the Union Navy. The main thing that the Union Navy did was, if we have time, and I'll tell you a little bit about it, it was actually the idea of reenacting living history. It's best to join a group. The blockade consisted of 4 coastal blockading squadrons and there's again Mississippi squadron. The 3 in yellow were part of the blockade in Florida. Between 2011 and 2015, St. John's River was the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of South Civil War, 1861, 1865. We can see here down to about, I was a contributing blogger to this website, Civil War Navy Sesquicentennial, and I largely posted actions on. And so the major activities of the Union Navy website was Naval History and Heritage Command blockade, and I posted mainly Florida actions, on this date in 1863, material into the South, this happened over Tampa Bay, that kinds of things. That when I was done, I had a couple of industrial capacity to manufacture papers, carry out commodities like cotton, turpentine, lumber, and such to sell overseas. So that was kind of the southern genesis of it. Also in Florida, as part of the blockade, there were numerous raids, when the war broke out. 2 guys in charge of the Navy, turpentine Union Navy, raided Gideon Wells, was President Lincoln's secretary or naval secretary, running ships. New Englander from Connecticut, he was one of the most loyal members of supporting Union sympathizers on shore. President didn't covet the president's job. Union folks, and Lincoln was very fond of blockading squadron reasons. He referred to him as organized those folks into guerrilla units. And then on the southern side, President Jefferson Davis supporting and developing appointed Stephen Russell Mallory as far as the southern Navy, and that kind of gives a Florida connection. Florida was still a relatively Confederate Navy because he was a Floridian. Just for the war, he was one of our 2 United States senators, along to David Lee defend representing Florida in the U.S. Senate. So that he had quite a bit of maritime experience. And also, background was in maritime law. And he had, because of chairman of the Senate Naval Affairs Committee, to defend against seaborne invasion. So, in essence, all of them.
And so the main thing that the Union Navy did was implement the blockade.
Were withdrawn by it was actually the idea of sent to serve
Union
General
Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia
or to serve
the
out west in
blockade
the
consisted
Western
of
theater.
4 coastal
So there was really
blockading
no major
squadrons and a
Confederate
5th
naval presence
Mississippi
in the war.
squadron.
Other than
Those, the
a little
3
bit
in yellow were
Navy
part of the
gunboat
blockade
activity
of
on the
Florida.
Apalachicola River.
And there's a
mainly
map
to
showing
defend
that.
The St. Johns River, which
North-
was one of their
northeast
important
Florida,
industrial
was under the
centers.
purview
There
of
was
the,
one
South
Confederate
Atlantic
Navy gunboat
blockading
permanently
squadron,
stationed in Florida.
which
That was
we
the
can see
CSS
here down
Spray,
to about
which helped guard the
Mosquito
inlet,
Inlet,
what
what
was
was
then
then
called
called the Big
Mosquito
Inlet,
Inlet.
current day Ponce Inlet. Ponce de Leon.
So in terms of the St. Johns River,
And so the major activities of the Union
in
Navy
late
in Florida
1861 with the
to
arrival of
implement
the
the
blockade, which meant
steamer
intercepting
USS
or
Beagle,
cutting out
a lot
blockade
both
runners
on both
trying to
sides really
bring
Union and Confederate.
material
A lot of their
into the
gunboats
South
were
weapons,
weapons,
uniforms,
uniforms,
acquired,
things that
or just
the
taken
South didn't
over
really
by
have
the
the
industrial
navies and
capacity to
converted into a
manufacture
gunboat.
and
The
carry
Beagle
out
was one of those.
commodities
It was bought
like
by the
cotton,
Union Navy.
turpentine,
It was a
lumber,
freighter
and such.
and it was converted into
to
a
sell
gunboat.
overseas.
You can
to help
see a lot
finance
of the
some
larger
war
gunboats.
effort. Also in
Civil
Florida,
War
as part of
period,
the blockade, there were
that
numerous
whole
raids,
naval
naval
raids,
raids, a
on
time of
manufacturing
tremendous
facilities like
technological
salt
change.
works,
So ships
turpentine
were
stills and such,
transitioning
raids up
from
rivers and into
sail
the bays to
powered
capture,
steam
either
powered.
capture
A
or
lot of the
destroy
ships were
blockade running
They have
ships.
steam engine,
A lot
but
of
they also
support
have
for
sail
army
rig.
activities
You'll see
on
that in
shore.
my illustrations.
Supporting Union sympathizers
Interestingly,
on
the
shore.
blockade
The really
progressed.
Union
Still a few
blockade progressed
pro-Union
very much
folks in
like
Florida.
and the
The
East
naval
Gulf
war,
blockading
Pacific in World War
squadron
II,
too.
the
The
Navy
Navy
would take
organize
an
those
area to
folks
use
into
as a
guerrilla
important
units,
staging
sort of
area.
help
Then they
fight the
move
war
on
from
and
the
take the
rear,
next
as it
area
were,
and the next
supporting and
area.
developing
So
these
in
resistant movements.
late 1861,
As far as the Southern Navy
Union
here
Navy
in Florida,
acquired
little to
Port
none.
Royal,
Florida
South
was still a
Carolina,
relatively
to
new
use as a
state,
major
naval base, and then they started working their way
which was
south.
one of the
In
big
early
jobs
March,
of the Confederate
they took further
Navy was
east
to try
Fort
to
Lynch, the Mount
defend
Mary
and
River,
keep open
and then a week
South's
later,
major ports.
Union
So
Navy
that
squadron
blockade runners could
arrived
get
off
in.
the
And
mouth
also
of the St.
Confederate
John's River.
leadership decided pretty early in the
And
war,
eventually they,
because of
they
Florida's
captured or the
extensive
Navy
coast,
took
it would be
over,
very
the Navy took
difficult
over
to defend
little
against
town of Mayport
seaborne
Mills,
invasions.
and then
So
called
in
Mayport
essence,
Mills,
all of the
or
and they
most,
established
if
a
not all
Navy
of the
base
Confederate
there,
Army
and
units
that
formed in
effectively
Florida
shut
were
down the St. John's
withdrawn
River.
by
If you've ever
the
been to the mouth
St.
too,
John's
and they
River,
were sent
it's
to
only,
serve
with
Lee and the
150
Army of
yards
Northern
wide or
Virginia,
so.
or to
So just
serve
a
out
few
west in
gunboats
the
that
western
could really
theater.
seal off
So there was
the
really no
So
major
Jacksonville and
Confederate
Palatka
naval
were
presence
never
in the war,
used as major
other
ports
than
by
a
the
little bit of
Confederacy.
Confederate Navy
Pretty
gunboat
much
activity on the
after
Apalachicola
early
River,
1862.
mainly to defend Columbus,
Um,
Georgia, which was one
in,
of their important industrial
March
centers.
12th,
There was
the
one
first
Confederate
Union
Navy gunboat
occupation
Jacksonville
stationed in
occurred.
Florida.
That
That
was
was
the
the
CSS Spray,
4th New
which
Hampshire
helped guard
was landed by the
St.
Navy of
Mark's on the Big
Jacksonville.
Bend. And as some of you know, Jacksonville was
So
in terms of the St. Johns River,
abandoned
the
by
blockade
the
arrived
Union
until after
in
the
late
Battle of Luskin,
1861
when
with
it
the
was
arrival
permanently
of the
occupied by Union forces.
steamer
in
USS
1864.
Beagle.
But so the
A
first
lot both
occupation
on
on
both
both
sides,
sides,
really,
really, March
Union and
the
Confederate.
next
A
day,
lot
on
of their
15th,
gunboats,
the gunboat
were merchant
merchant
vessels
vessels that were
acquired,
conducts a
or
probe
taken
taken
over
over
by
by
one
one
of
of
the
the
navies and
This was
converted
a
into a
purpose-built gunboat.
The
This was
Beagle
not
was one of
merchant
those. It was
vessel.
bought by
This
the
was
Union Navy.
called the
It was a freighter,
90-day
and it was
gunboats
converted
went
into a
gunboat.
class. Again,
You can see a
it's
lot of the
very
larger gunboats,
sail-powered,
but
with the steam engine.
Civil War
They were
period,
designed to be
as
shallow
that
draft
hold
enough to
late
go into the
1800s
shallow
period,
bays,
a time of
up
tremendous
rivers,
technological
but also
change.
big enough
So
to
ships
go
were
and operate at sea.
transitioning
And
from
so we have
sail
evidence
powered
that
to steam
eventually
powered. And
the
a lot of the
Aqua made
ships
its way
were
up to
a hybrid.
Africa.
They have a steam engine, but they also have a sail rig.
And you'll see
The
that in my
minutes of the session
illustrations
of the First Presbyterian
Church
Church.
say
And
on
interestingly,
March
the blockade
14th,
progressed, the Union blockade progressed very much like
that was the
gunboat, the
World
naval
War
war in
off,
the Pacific in
off
World War II.
Palatka.
The Navy would
the
take
commander
an area and use
Thomas
as a
told
port
us
staging
Stevens
area.
shore.
Then they
Some of his
move on
officers
and take the
met
next
with,
area and the next
the
area.
Palatka
So
folks
and
in,
reassured them that
late
they were not there to
1861,
terrorize
the
the
Union Navy
We get a little other
acquired,
evidence of
Port
that.
Royal, South
Richard
Carolina,
Adams
used
was
as
a
a major
sometime
naval base,
and then they started working
steamers
their
up
way
and
south.
south.
In
In
early
early
March,
March,
he wrote
they
his
took
diary.
Fredina
Federal gun clinch out in the St. Mary's River. And then a week later, Union had the same day. He kind of thought they'd be after him.
St. John's
And then
River.
just a few days later, in his
And
report
eventually
to
they
his flag officer,
captured, or the Navy
took
time,
over,
Union
Stevens
Navy
wrote
took
about
over his
little town of
expedition up
Mayport
Palatka.
Mills,
So
what was then
says
called, I had made a reconnaissance as far as and they established a Navy base there. And that effectively shut down the St. John's River. Because if you've ever been to the mouth of St. John's River, It's only, 150 yards wide or so. So just a few gunboats
what the America's
really
Cup
spill
is.
off the river.
Kind of
So
the
Jacksonville and
Super Bowl
Palatka
trophy
were
of
never
yacht
used
racing.
as major.
There's
ports
actually a
by the
link between
Confederacy.
the America's
Pretty
Cup
much
and
after
St.
early
John's River.
1862.
The very first racing schooner yacht in America
in
built, I believe,
March
by
12th,
the
the first
investors with the
Union
Yacht
occupation
Club
of Jacksonville
in the
occurred
1850s.
when the
It went over to
Fort New
England
Hampshire
and
was
participated in this yacht race
Jacksonville
around the British Islands.
Jacksonville was
And it
ultimately
won
occupied and then abandoned by
Brits, who at
the
the time
Union until
were
after
regarded
the
as the
Battle of
best
Lusky,
sailors in
when
the
it was
world.
pretty much
It had a radical hull design,
occupied by Union
much more
forces and
hydrodynamic,
much faster.
But so the first
And,
occupation
it
of
also had a
Jacksonville,
big
12
sail
March.
rig.
The next
So
day
they
on the
won
13th,
this trophy,
the
which at
gunboat
the time,
USS
one
Ottawa,
of the names of it
was
the
conducted
conducted
a
probe
up the
and
St. John's
then of course
River.
subsequent.
This was a
Yacht
purpose-built
America
gunboat.
winning
This was not
winning
a
and
merchant
winning that
vessel.
trophy.
This was
And
a
that's why it eventually became known as
90-day
the America's gunboats or Unadilla
But
class.
that very
Again, you can
first
see it's
racing
hybrid
yacht America,
sail-powered
after it
engine.
won that
They were
race,
designed to be
the
shallow draft
owners,
enough
I guess,
to go
to
get
get
their
to
money
the
back
shallow
because there were no
bays,
sponsorships
up
back
the
then.
rivers.
They sold
But
it
also
to a
British
British
enough
enough
to be
and it
seagull
evidently
operated
changed
at
hands
sea.
one or two
And
times.
so we have
Eventually
evidence
was
that
renamed the
eventually
Camilla.
the Ottawa
And
made
when the
its way
Civil
up
War
to
broke out,
Alaska.
the owner at that time decided to become a blockade
The
runner.
minutes of the
So he
session
ran a
ran a cargo
cargo
in
with
church,
that,
say on March
with that yacht
14th,
into Jacksonville, and there was much partying and celebration.
That was the
going
gunboat
on, and then the
O2
Union
off,
Navy
off
arrived
Palatka.
off St. John's
The
River.
commander,
pretty much
Lieutenant
bottled it
Thomas
up.
Hold Up
So
Stevens,
he
came
ended
ashore
up with some of his officers and
the
met
yacht
with,
to the
the
Confederacy.
Palatka folks.
They took the
and
masts
reassured
off
them that
and
they
they
had
were
the
not there to
hull
terrorize
towed
the
upstream.
We get a little other evidence
for
that,
okay,
Richard
just,
Adams
was a sometime blockade runner.
He would run steamers up and down.
Captain
St.
Stevens of the
John's,
Ottawa
he wrote
found
his
out about
diary
this because
federal
this was a
gunboat
famous
arrived at
boat.
Palatka,
You know,
and
that
half an
what it
hour
had done,
I
took
took
to
to
was
was
amazing.
the same day.
All
They
good
thought
sailors
maybe
knew
after
about
him.
this.
And then just a few days later, in his report to his flag officer,
and he sent a
DuPont,
salvage party.
Stevens wrote about
raised
his
it, which they
expedition
did,
up to
brought it to
Palatka.
Jacksonville,
So,
says I had made a
spent
most of the rest of the war
found no hostile
off,
demonstrations.
Charleston,
and again,
South
he
Carolina.
assured the citizens,
And I think eventually
not
after
here
the war, it was to terrorize training
them.
vessel by the U.S. Naval Academy. But there's that link, the
Um,
very first schooner yacht. Everybody knows what the America's
that
Cup is.
that became
the
the
America's
America's
Cup
Super Bowl
here on
trophy
St.
of
John's
yacht
River.
racing.
There's actually a link,
and so there
between
were
the America's
multiple
Cup
Confederate
and
attempts
eventually
St. John's
the
River.
Union Navy,
The
very
very
much
first
owned
racing
St. John's
schooner
River,
yacht
east up to Lake
America
George.
was built.
So the Confederates made several
a group of
attempts to try
investors with the
to
New York Yacht Club
squash
in
that.
the 1850s.
Summer of
It went over
1862,
to
they constructed
England
an
and
earthwork
participated in this
battery
yacht
race
race
around the
around
British
on
Islands.
St. John's Bluff.
And it
Part
won
of St. John's Bluff
is
in
in
the
the
Fort
Brits,
Caroline
who at
National
time
Memorial,
regarded as
most
the
of
best
it
sailors
is
in the
the
world.
St. John's
It had a
Bluff
radical
subdivision
hull design
that's
that's
made
just
much
much
more
more
hydrodynamic
of the
much
memorial,
faster.
but,
So the Confederates
also had a
constructed a
big
battery
sail
there
rig.
and a secondary
So
battery
they won this
upstream on the
trophy,
other
which at
bank
the
of the
time,
river.
one of the
Yellow
names of
Bluff,
it was
that's the Yellow Bluff
historic site.
And then, of
Currently.
course, subsequent
Yacht
again,
Americans
most
kept
of
winning
what
and
really
winning
decided
that
the
trophy
battery was,
and that's why it eventually became known as the Americas.
There's a little
But
county
that
park
very
with the
first
monument
racing
to
yacht
Jean
America,
Ribault,
after it won that race,
Protestants who tried
the
to
owners, I
establish
guess,
a
to get their money back because there were no
on the lower
sponsorships
St. John's.
back then.
So
They
from
sold
that
it to a
park,
British
this is
citizen,
looking
and it
downstream on
evidently
the St.
changed
John's
hands
River.
one or two
Really
times.
gives you a feel
Eventually
of the
was
command
renamed
the
the
Gunboat
Camilla.
would have had.
And when the
of,
Civil War
of
broke
the
out,
river.
the
And,
owner at
and I
that
do
time
do a
decided to become a blockade runner. So he ran a cargo with that yacht into Jacksonville.
slave who
And there
worked
was
on
much
the
partying and
earthworks,
celebration
escaped,
going on,
made his
and
way
the
to the
Union
Navy
Navy
base
arrived
Mayport
off
and
the St.
told
John's River. The guys
pretty
about
much
what
what
was
was
going
going
on. So
on
he
September
ended up
11th,
selling
the
Steedman
to
Commander Charles Steedman. They took the masts
time now
off,
the
and
ranking
had the
naval
hull
officer on the St.
towed
John's.
upstream.
He sent
and
two
sunk
gunboats,
Dunn's
Dunn's
Creek,
Creek, Patroon, to
kind
kind
of
of
probe
just
the battery and see
north
what was
of here.
going on. They did get into a
Captain
firefight
Stevens
with
of
it
the Ottawa
morning
found
of,
out about this
September
because
11th.
this was a
They
famous
blasted away
boat,
at each other for a while. And
what it had
eventually,
done,
the two
was
gunboats
an
made their
amazing
way back
accomplishment.
to all good
Mayport.
sailors knew about this.
And so
About
somehow
a
he
week
later,
an
a
informant
larger
told him
fleet
about
of
where it
five
was,
gunboats were
and he
sent
sent a
up to
salvage
engage
party
the battery
to
and
raise it
again,
again. They brought after a few hours of back on each
spent
other.
most of the rest of the war.
They had to
Actually,
retreat back to
off,
Mayport.
One of the
Charleston,
things
South
that we
Carolina.
learned in the
And
Civil
I think
War,
eventually
interesting,
after the war,
the
it was used as
advances
a training
in
vessel
naval
by the
gunnery
US Naval
rendered
Academy.
masonry
But there's that link,
structures
the
like
very
Fort
first Clinch, member of Fort Pulaski, outside of Savannah, the America's Cup, was here on the Union bombardments. Fort Sumter, these masonry forts,
so there were
just
multiple Confederate
blown
attempts.
to bits
Eventually,
by
the Union Navy
both
pretty
naval
much
and Army
owned
heavy
St.
gunnery.
John's River,
But
at
the
least up to Lake
earthworks were
George.
remarkably
So the
resistant
Confederates
to,
made
to
several attempts to try to squash that. In the summer of 1862, they constructed an earthworks and a battery of heavy guns that
on St.
John's
John's
going to
Bluff.
have to be a
Part
joint
of St.
Army
John's
Navy
Bluff
operation
is in
to
the,
take Fort Caroline
the
National
earthworks on
Memorial.
St. John's
Most
Bluff.
of
So
it
late
is the
St. John's Bluff
force of
subdivision.
1,500
That's
soldiers
just
sent
outside
down from
of
Fort
the
Royal,
memorial.
South
But,
Carolina.
so the Confederates
And they
landed a
constructed
battery
the,
there.
now
Now
secondary
secondary
battery
battery
and
upstream on the
just
other
downstream
bank
of the battery
on Yellow
upstream
Bluff.
of St.
That's
John's
the Yellow
Bluff
Bluff.
historic
They began
site.
to work their way
Currently,
towards the battery. The
again, most of where
really
way
the
overestimated
battery
the
size
size
of
that
the
subdivision.
Union
He
St.
thought it
John's
was more like
Bluff
5,000. But there's a
troops.
little county
And so
park
he
with a
ordered,
monument
the gun
to
spike
Jean
and,
Ribault
that
led
his
group of
guys
French
abandoned
Protestants who
the
tried to
battery.
establish
And eventually a naval
there
landing
in
party
the lower
occupied
St.
the
John's.
battery.
So
in
from
early
that
October
part,
and
this
turned
is
it over
looking
to the
downstream on the
Union.
St. John's River.
Really
And
gives you a
also
feel
about
of
at
the
the same
command
time,
the gun
they
battery
also
would have
abandoned the
of
other
the river.
earthworks up at Yellow Bluff.
And I do a Reb. I do a Reb artilleryman.
So that kind of opened the river,
and really after
So,
that there were a number of forays.
a slave
of
who
gunboats
worked on the
river.
earthworks.
One of these was
made
the
his way to
encounter
the Navy base.
in
We were
Mayport.
talking about
Told,
how the guys about what was
the
going
Navy
on.
gunboat.
So on
believe it
September
was the
11th,
oldest, landed at Palatka.
Steedman,
Commander
Commander
Charles
came
Steedman
ashore
was at the
and
time
he
now
asked,
ranking naval officer. on
former
St.
Governor
John's.
Mosley if
He
there were any
sent two
Confederates in
gunboats to
town.
Uncas and
Governor
Petrus
Mosley
to kind of
drone the battery.
But then
and
when he
what
went back to his ship,
they
did get
saw
into a
troops in
firefight with it the morning
sneaking
of
through town.
September.
So he thought he had
11th.
been lied to.
Away at each other for a while.
So number one,
eventually
he
the
sent
two
a landing
gunboats
party
made their
ashore
way
to
back
arrest
to
former Governor Mosley,
Mayport.
and then he was going to
And
shell
so
the town.
about a
but
week later, a
Lady
larger
Boyd,
fort,
Mary
Mary
Boyd,
Boyd,
talked him out of
sent
it.
up to engage the
And
battery.
you've seen,
I do again. After a few hours of blasting away at each other, can't remember her last name. She's with
they
the
had
same
to retreat
group.
back to
But
Mayport.
we do
One of the things
you know,
that we
Captain-
learned in the Civil
Captain,
War, it was interesting.
the
Captain
advances
and the
in naval gunnery,
But
masonry
they mainly
structures like
were
Fort
destroying
Clinch,
every
member
little
of Fort
scout
Pulaski
they could get.
outside of
No
Savannah,
bridges
which
across
was
the St.
devastated
John's. So
by
that's how
Union
Confederate
bombardments.
forces were
Fort
able to cross
Sumter,
the St.
these
John's.
masonry forts
So,
would just be.
And then there were
blown to
other
bits
Union
by
expeditions
both
up the
naval
St.
and Army
John's
heavy
River.
gunnery.
But the
earthworks were remarkably resistant.
Steamer
to,
Darlington,
to
one of
Jacob Brock's boats, was captured outside of Fernandina when the Union occupied Fernandina and Fort Clinch. Then it became a Union blockading vessel. They were going to have a voyage up to St. John's along with
to
take
to
capture
the
on St. John's Bluff.
Confederate
Late
steamer
September,
Governor Milton,
a
which
force
was
of
1,500
soldiers was sent
earthworks
down
on
from St.
Fort
John's
Royal,
Bluff,
South
Carolina.
And
And
they
then
were
landed at the mouth of was it San
Later
Pablo
on,
Creek,
there were
just
expeditions
downstream
to
of the
Columbine
battery
before it was
downstream of St.
destroyed.
John's
Went
Bluff
actually
there.
as far
They began to work
down
their
the
way
river
towards the
upriver,
battery.
really,
The
going
Confederate
south.
commander,
As Lake Monroe,
way
to capture
overestimated
some other
the
size
Confederate
of Union
steamers.
force.
What
He
was
thought it
going
was
on
like
here
5,000
was
troops.
by,
And
you
so
know,
he
late
ordered the
1862,
gun
by
spike
the middle of the war,
that
his guys abandoned
the Union, both
the
Union,
battery, and
Navy,
eventually a
and
naval
Army
landing party
occupiers,
occupied the battery
they
in early
had
October and
Fernandina,
turned it over
they
to
had
the-
Fort
to the
Clinch,
Army.
so that harbor was shut
And
down.
also about at the
They
same
had St.
time,
Augustine.
they also abandoned
and,
the
Fort
other
Marion,
earthworks up
Castillo.
at Yellow
That
Bluff.
was shut down.
And,
St. John's River was shut down.
So
there was
that
no
kind
way
of
for
opened the
blockade
river,
runners
and really
to get
after
into
that,
any of
there were
those
a number
ports.
of forays of
So the
Union
runners
gunboats
began
up the river,
running into
one of these was the encounter
cargo at
we were talking
about.
or even going further south to Jupiter.
Navy gunboat,
we
coming
believe
up
it was the
river.
Uncas, you know,
And they landed their
at
cargo,
Palatka.
and the cargo
The commander
would be
came
carried
ashore,
over to the St.
and
John's
he
River,
asked
loaded on
former Governor
Confederate
Mosley
steamers.
if there were
These
any
were
Confederates in
civilian
town.
steamers, not
Governor
Confederate
Mosley said
Navy.
no,
Vessels.
they're not.
And they would
But
bring
then
it
when we
down
went back to the
ship.
ship,
They
they
saw
saw
troops
in
in
Ray
the
sort of
area,
sneaking
where
through
it would
town.
again be
So he thought he had been
wagons,
lied
and they
to.
would get it over to
So number
Gainesville,
one,
where they
he
could
sent
get
a
it on
landing
railroads
party
and
ashore
get,
to arrest,
former Governor
where they
Mosley,
needed
and then he was going to
shell
shell
the
the
town.
town.
George
but,
Bucher
Lady
called this
Boyd,
running the
Mary
inner
Boyd,
blockade, talked him out
So
of it.
the
St.
St.
John's basically
Maybe you've
upstream.
seen,
I do a
Lake
Lake
George
George
was
was still
still
kind of Confederate territory.
Honey,
And
remember
the
last
Union
name.
expedition, St.
capture
group.
these
But
steamers.
we do,
Carrying
Captain,
cargo. And
the
really,
captain
much of
and
the
this
naval
Civil
War
But so,
was what we call
they
a
mainly
ground war.
were
It was
destroying
fought,
every little boat
you know,
and scow they
in
could
the
get.
littorals,
Bridges
the
across
shallow
the St.
bays and
John, so that's how
estuaries, up
Confederate
the rivers
forces
and
were able to
such.
cross the St.
Interestingly,
Johns.
the next time
So,
you And then there were other Union 100 years later up the St. Johns River.
But, World War I, World War II,
that
was a blue water war.
Steamer Darlington, one of Jacob Brock's boats, was captured outside of
the fight against
Fernandina
submarines,
when the Union occupied Fernandina and Fort Lynch. Then it became a Union
there were
blockade
again,
vessel.
there were
It
attempts
made a
to
voyage
fight
up the
back.
St.
Union
Johns
naval
landing
landing
party
party
was
ambushed to capture the
resort
Confederate
Steamer
Springs, which is just north of
helped
Milton
build the
Springs,
earthworks
in
St.
November
John's
of
Bluff
1862.
And then
So
that was on. There were
Fortunately, there were no casualties.
destroyed. It went actually as far downriver to
upward,
really.
And then, of course, what Bob talked to you
Lake
about
Monroe
to
to
capture
capture
some
some
other Confederate gunboats.
What was going on here
Cavalry
was by
Dickinson.
late
That was
1862,
in
by the
May
middle
of
of
1864.
the Union, both
couple
Union,
things,
Navy and
a few months
Army
ago,
occupiers,
a private
they had
individual who used to live
Fernandina,
here, but
they
he
had
was in
Fort
Alabama
Lynch,
now.
so
That
that
harbor was
had
shut down.
purchased. They had
From
St. Augustine,
a diver who
had
had
salvaged
salvaged
some
some
artifacts.
artifacts
That was
off
shut
of,
down.
the
St. John's
Columbine.
River was
And
shut
he
down.
had them,
So there was
because he
no
wanted
way
to
for
see
the
the
blockade
blockade
runners
runners
to get
and
in.
so
Any
he
of those
loaned
ports.
them to the Putnam County
So the
Historical
runners
Society.
began
We have them
having
on
on
display
Mosquito
at
Inlet
Historical
and
Museum
landing their
next
cargo
to
in
the
Smyrna,
House, and
or even
we're
going
open.
further south to
museum is
Jupiter
open
the first weekend of the
coming
month,
up
Saturday and
River,
Sunday from
and
1
they
to
land
4.
their cargo,
Typically,
and the cargo would be carried over
So we have the artifacts there.
The other
Loaded
thing is,
on
us Black
steamers,
County
these were
people like to
civilian
say that
steamers,
this was the
Navy
only time,
vessels,
a
and they would bring it down to
Astor
U.S. Naval
or the
vessel.
Wallacca area.
Well,
not
where
quite.
it would
was the
again be
first
loaded
time,
on wagons,
but not the
and
only
they would
time.
get it over to
Several months
Gainesville, where
later,
they
in
could get it
October
on railroads
of
to get
1864,
up Nathan
where it was
Bedford
needed
Forest,
elsewhere
where
in
cavalry
Confederacy.
Bedford
George
Forest
Bucher
actually ambushed and captured a Union
So the
naval
St.
gunboat
John's basically
and some
upstream
transports on
of
the Tennessee
of
River.
Lake George.
He
was
actually
still
tried to make his own little
Confederate
Forest River gunboat.
And
There were Union expeditions to capture
the
these
urban
steamers.
legend is that
Somehow Forrest
carrying
had
that
read
cargo.
about
And really, much of the naval Civil War was
and,
what we call a brown
was either
water
inspired
war.
to fought,
in the
he didn't want
in
some
littorals,
part of
the
cracker
shallow
to get all that
bays and
glory.
estuaries. I don't know. I think they were
Interesting. The
next
next
time
time
the
you
US
stuff.
They
They
would
had
go
a
for brown water
rash.
war, very
It was
bold
100 years
commanders.
later, Vietnam.
And then
But
probably the
World
biggie,
War I,
that,
World War II,
after
that was a
after
blue
St.
water
John's
war.
Bluff,
We had
the
big
battery,
fleet,
the next big attempt to
the
try to
open
stop
ocean.
or
The
the fight
Navy,
against the
use of
German
St. John's
submarines
River,
was
convoys
the
and all that.
planting of what were then called
So,
there were again, there were attempts
stationary
to fight back,
devices,
explosive
landing
devices
party was
planted in
ambushed
the river
at
when a
resort
ship
at
called
Magnolia
Magnolia Springs, which is just north of
blow a big
Gunboats
hole in
Springs,
it and sink it.
November of
1862.
the Confederate Navy under Mallory.
So
Secretary
that was
Mallory,
one.
really
Fortunately, there were no
casualties
casualties
in the Civil War.
They
They sort of advanced the three emerging
naval
technologies.
technologies.
And then, of course, what Bob talked to you about,
warships,
the loss
vessels,
of the
Union
submersible type
Columbine,
vessels, the
Second
cavalry, and then a
under,
semi-submersible gunboat
that was in May of
and then
1864.
torpedoes.
Matthew Fontaine Maury
Couple
really
things.
took this
A
technology
few months
kinda
ago, up a
few notches
private
to the next
individual
level.
used to live
But,
here, but
so
in
in
Alabama now.
about March,
he
April,
had purchased
Confederate General Beauregard from his
a
headquarters
diver
in
who
Charleston
had salvaged
ordered
some
mines
artifacts
to be
off
placed in the
of
St. John's
the
River
Columbine.
to try to
And
stymie
he had
the
them
US
because he
Navy's,
wanted to see them stay in
complete
Florida.
control of
And
the
so
river.
he's
And
loaned
that
them
was
to
done
the Putnam County
in
Historical
mid to
Society.
late March.
We have them on
A
display
display
at the
torpedoes
Torpedoes
was placed in
Museum
St.
next
John's
to the
River
Bronson
off
House.
Mandarin
And
Point.
we're open.
The
And
museum is
on
open
April
the first
1st,
of the month, Saturday and
Union
Sunday
Army
from
transport
1 to 4.
Maple,
Typically, I
was on its way
open
back
and
downriver.
So we have the artifacts.
She
There.
dropped off.
The other
some
thing
troops,
is,
Black
was
coming back to
like
Jacksonville or Mayport.
This was the only
When
time
as she rounded
a
Mandarin
land
Point,
base force struck one of these
sunk
mines
and
went
US
down.
naval vessel.
Well,
Not
of the,
quite.
was the first time
sailors,
not the only
worked
time.
down in
Several
the
months
Black
later,
Gang
in
and the steam
October
engine
of
were drowned,
1864,
but the rest of
Nathan
the
Bedford
crew and
Forrest,
some
Confederate
cavalry
carrying
Nathan
civilian
Bedford Forrest
passengers,
actually
made it
ambushed
off
and
the
captured
wreck.
a Union
actually,
Navy
a few weeks
gunboat
later,
and some
another
transports on the
transport,
Tennessee River.
And
he actually tried to make his own little
Forest
Forest
River
River
gunboat. This is a Alfred Ward sketch.
The
of
urban
West
legend is that
Navy.
somehow
General
Forrest
Hunter
had
read
St.
about
John's River
the
had
Mandarin
been
Point.
told about.
As some of you know,
and
eventually
the
was either
the
inspired
tide
to do
duplicate
such,
just
just sort of buried
didn't
these
want
wrecks
some Florida
start a cracker
And,
to get all that
key
fluoride.
point,
Some of you might
I don't
he's
know,
a
I just
dentist,
think
but
they
he's
were
also
both
he and some of his
same
buddies are
stuff.
technical
They
divers,
both-
brash,
He
very
found
bold
the
commanders.
He and his
And
divers
then
were able to
probably the
salvage
biggie
large
that,
amount of
after
material
St.
off the
John's
wreck of
Bluff,
Maple
the
Leaf.
battery,
Some of that is
the
on
next big
display
attempt
at the
to
Mandarin
try to
Museum
stop
up in
the
Mandarin.
Union Navy.
Some is on display at
use
St.
in
John's
Museum of
River.
Science and
Was
History,
the planting of what were
I think
then
there's a
called
little bit at the Museum
torpedoes,
of
what
History
they
of
would call
Tallahassee. A
mines.
lot of the artifacts.
Okay,
are
stationary
right now
devices,
in the warehouse.
explosive devices planted in the river.
So
when I was told,
they
men
know
know
the
the
Mandarin
Mandarin
Museum
Museum
recently,
blow a big hole
underwent
in
an
it
expansion,
and
so they
sink
now
it.
have a specific
And,
gallery donated.
The Confederate Navy
under
to the Maple
under,
Leaf and its
Mallory,
artifacts.
Secretary Mallory, really kind of
in a sense, the psychological
sort of
effect of
advanced
these
things
three
as
great
as the
naval
physical
technologies, the ironclad
sailor
warships,
ships, vessels,
terrified of these things,
submersible
They
type
were
vessels, the
machines,
and then a semi-submersible
and,
gunboat.
they
called
did have
David's,
the
and then torpedoes,
effect of
Matthew
kind of
Fontaine
curtailing
really
naval
took
activities
technology
on the
kind of
St. Johns River.
a few notches
Um,
to the next
I say
level.
four,
But
four Union
so in
transports, and you
about
had these
March,
two,
April,
and eventually two
Confederate
more,
General
Beauregard
from
from
his
his
headquarters
headquarters
in
in
Charleston
Charleston
have to change
ordered
that
mines to
three
be placed in the St. John's River
sunk by
to try to
torpedoes.
stymie
Because
the U.S. Navy's
a few months ago,
complete control of the river. And that was done in
Civil
mid
War
to
Navy
late
magazine,
March. There was a really
spread of
interesting
torpedoes
research
was
article
placed
by
in St. John's
Ron
River
Field
off Mandarin Point,
who
basically,
on
I think
April
pretty much
1st,
proved
the
that one of
Union
those
Army
transports,
transport
Alice
Maple
Price,
Leaf, was on its way
actually
back
was not
downriver.
sunk by a torpedo.
She had dropped
It's
off
had
some
the
troops
maps
at
of
Palatka
Palatka
and
and
headed
back
back
to
she
either
was
Jacksonville
recovering
or
parts of a
Mayport
sawmill
when
she
she
rounded
rounded
Mandarin
Point
Point
and
struck one of these mines
which is
and
what
went
they say
down.
broke the ship's back.
Four
You know,
of
basically
the
fractured the hull.
sailors
sank.
who worked
it
down
appears
in
Alice
the
Price,
Black
but
Gang
the
and
rumor
the
always
Sea
has been, oh, it
was
was drowned.
torpedo,
But the rest of the crew and some
passengers
effectively
carrying some civilian
demonstrated
passengers
that, made it off the wreck. And actually, a few weeks later,
So,
another transport.
really, and by then, despite
General
these,
Hunter
was
was
sunk
these
in the same
victories
area.
pretty much
This
by
is a
Alfred
mid to
Boyd
late
sketch of the
1864.
wrecks of Maple Leaf.
It was
General Hunter
in St. John's
the
River
conclusion that the
at
Confederacy
one
was
point.
losing.
As some of you
the
know,
war. In
eventually
1865,
the
there was the Battle of
the
Natural
tides
Bridge,
and such
sort of
like
like
they're
buried
the
these
Confederacy's
wrecks.
last
And
stand.
Keith Holland,
defeating
some
a
of you might
Union
know,
force,
he's a
trying to make
dentist,
his
but
way
he's
to
also
Tallahassee.
he and some of his buddies are
But
technical
pretty much
divers.
by now,
He found the
paper.
paper, despite
He and his
their
divers
efforts
were
use
able to salvage
technology,
a large amount of
just
material
didn't quite work.
off the
It
wreck
was
of
too
Maple
little
Leaf.
to
Some of that is on
so,
display at the
that's
Mandarin
kind of the
up in
story
Mandarin.
of
Some is on
display at the
on
Museum of
the,
Science and
St. John's
History,
River
Jacksonville.
during the Civil
I think there's a
War.
little bit at the Museum of History in Tallahassee.
Looks like
A
we're
lot of
pretty good on
artifacts
time
are right now.
Yeah,
sitting in
so
the warehouse.
I'll tell you a little bit out. So again,
But
adventure
so,
reenactments,
yeah,
and
and
I'm
there's
various
various
units.
men know the
going
Mandarin
in,
Museum
here in
recently
Florida,
underwent an
on the Army
expansion,
side,
so they now have a specific
the
gallery
Confederates
donated
portray
for
Confederate
dedicated
regiments
to the
formed
Maple
here
Leaf
in
and
Florida.
its artifacts.
The Union
guys
in
portray
a sense,
Union
the
Army
psychological
regiments
effect
actually
of these
fought
things
were
was as
stationed
great
here in
as
Florida.
the physical.
In the case of
damage.
Navy, you
Called
portray
the
sailors
crew
of
of a
terrified
gunboat
things
that
that
earned the
operated
nickname
in infernal
Florida.
machines.
So when I first got into this, I was a
they
member
did
of
have
USS
the
Henry
Living History
effect of kind of
Association.
curtailing
The Fort
Henry
Henry
was the New
activities
York
on
City
the
ferry boat,
St. John's
number of
River
which
were
Um,
acquired by the
I say
Union Navy,
four
converted
Union
into
gunboats.
gunboats.
So you had these
It
two,
was a little over
eventually
150
two more
foot long, sunk by
Most of the
torpedoes,
ferries
although I
were
think I'm
armed
gonna
with
have to
6
change
guns,
that to
usually two
Union
9-inch
sunk by
Dahlgren
torpedoes,
guns,
because
and
I'm 32
a
pounders.
few months ago,
The
Dahlgren would have been what's called in pivot. So
in,
you can see it could pivot
Civil
this
War
way
Navy magazine
to the
there was a
rear,
really
this
interesting
way, and then these
research
are what are
article
called
by
mounted in
Ron
broadside.
Field.
And there would have been 3
Um,
more guns
who
on the other
basically,
end.
I think
It
he
mainly
pretty much
served in
proved
the
that
east
one
one
of those
transports
transports, Alice
along the
Price,
Gulf Coast from Tampa Bay
actually
to
was
the
not
St.
sunk
Mark's
by a
River.
torpedo.
There are no known historic
maps
maps
and
or
all.
photos.
She was
of
recovering
Fort
parts of
Henry,
a sawmill,
but this is
bringing
the
it to
Commodore
another
Barney.
area.
Fort
and
Henry
struck
would
a
have
sandbar,
very
which
similar.
what they say broke the ship's back.
And you can see they could
fractured
have
the
these
hull. iron plates that they
sank.
could
So it
raise.
appears Alice
to protect
Price,
the crews
but the
from
rumor always
small
has been,
fire,
oh, it was sunk
because
by
if they make their way up
No,
a river,
it's not.
river.
I think Ron
they
very
would be
much
susceptible
to
demonstrate
demonstrate
that.
They weren't ironclads. They would have been pretty devastated by our
So,
artillery attack, just like
really,
the
by
Columbine
then,
was.
despite
These, But,
these
so
victories
what we
pretty
do
much by
is we
mid to
portray
late
the
1864
1864
reenactment
you know,
events.
it was
Again,
kind of
often the Navy went
a
ashore,
conclusion that the
assisted
Confederacy
Army
was
in
losing
some
the
way or
war,
another.
in
Or to assault
1865,
there was the Battle of Natural Bridge,
or a
sort of like the
turpentine
kind of
spill
the
or something like
Confederacy's
that.
last stand.
So there's our commander,
These are
these are Marines, these are Union Marines.
But pretty much
And you
by
can
now,
see the
it
various
was over.
iterations
Despite
of
their
sailor
efforts to use
uniforms.
technology.
I was their signalman.
It just didn't quite work, or it
doing
was
their,
too little,
their
too
signaling.
late.
This was
So,
at an event that no
that's
longer
kind of the
occurs.
story of naval activity on
And
the
then currently
St.
on
John's
I
River.
fall
during
in with
the guys with the USS Pawnee. Now that was
looks
a
like we're doing pretty good on time.
Navy warship.
Yeah, so
Let's
let's
tell
tell
you
you
about
about so
as a
again,
gunboat.
you know,
Again, it
big
was reenactments. You see the various
steam
units, you know,
sloop.
and
It had
here in
a sail
Florida,
rig
on the
fore
Army
and aft,
side,
but then again, it also had
you know, the
steam
Confederates
engine.
portrayed
It served in the
Confederate
South Atlantic
regiment
Squadron,
squadron here in Florida.
mainly
The
off
Union
Carolina
guys
coastline,
portrayed
South Carolina,
Union
but it did
Army
see some
regiments
service
that
in Florida.
actually fought
And
and were
the
stationed
Pawnee
here in
helped
Florida.
with the
In the
retaking
case
of
of Navy,
Fort
you
Clinch
portrayed
the crew
and actually
of
some of
a
her
gunboat
crews
saw some
that
service on the St.
operated
John's
in
River.
in
They were
Florida.
part of that
So
expedition
when I
that went
first
up
got
to
into
Lake
this, I was a
Monroe
member of
and
the
captured
USS
Hattie
Henry
and the
and
General
the History
Sumter.
Association. The Fort Henry was a
There's a very famous picture. There's a deck
which
scene
were
on the
acquired by the
Pawnee.
Union Navy.
So it was
converted into
bigger.
gunboats.
It was
221
a
foot
little over
plus in
150
length.
foot long.
Most of the ferries,
According
were
to
armed
the
with
Dictionary
6
of
guns,
American
naval
fighting
usually
ships
two
armed with
9-inch
9-inch
Dahlgren
Dahlgrens
and
and
4
4
32
Although in
pounders.
this picture,
The
here,
Dahlgren
you
would
can
have been
see
what's called
6
in
guns
pivot
here, and there
You can
probably
see
would have been
pivot
6
this
on the
way,
other.
to the rear or this
So I
way, and then these
understand
are
that
what
over
are
the
called
course
mounted
of
in
the war,
broadside.
there was a lot
There
of
would have been
changes
3
in
more
the
guns
area.
on the other end. It
Were sort
mainly
of
served
gunned up,
in the
you know,
East
to
Gulf
be more
blockading squadron.
formidable.
Along
And you
the
can
Gulf
see
Coast,
that
the Tampa
the
Bay
guys on the
to
deck,
St. Mark's
you know,
River.
this is what I'm wearing.
There are no known
illustrations
working
or
deck
photos
uniform
of
a
a
Union
Union
Navy
Navy
sailor,
but
this is the
jumper,
Commodore Barney,
trousers,
the Fort Henry
and
would
the,
have
and
looked
the
very
flat hat.
similar. And you can see,
And
that
again,
they could
have
have
these
most of
iron
the guys in
plates
this
they could
unit are
raise
Marines
to protect the
I'm
crews from small
currently
arms fire.
because if they make their way up a river,
Sometimes a couple other guys
they would be
fall in with
susceptible
us to.
But so again, we
they weren't
portray
ironclads.
a
They
naval
they
landing
would have been pretty
Marines and
devastated by
sailors.
artillery
This
attack,
is
just
us
like
at the
the
Columbine
Natural
was.
Bridge. That's where I'll be going.
But
So what we do,
and I guess it's
is
just
we
like in the
portray
real
naval
military,
landing
a lot of
party,
reenactment
is
events.
just
Again, often the Navy
so
went
we're
ashore
ready for you to
assist
go
the
into
Army
action.
in some way or another, or to assault a facility.
And so
like
this is an
Saltworks
event
or
that again,
turpentine
unfortunately, no
spill or
longer
something
occurs.
like that.
Property was sold. But this
So
was
there's our commander,
St.
Lieutenant
Andrews Bay.
These are Marines. These are Union Marines.
And you can see the various
raid
iterations
on a
of
Confederate
sailor
sailor
groups.
towards the end.
I
of
was their
war,
signalman.
The launches,
doing
which
their,
formerly
their
were
signalman.
powered
This
by
was at an
oar,
event
by
that no longer
sailors,
occurs.
actually had a little steam engine mounted in them, so a steam
And then
launch.
currently
I fall in with
actually
the guys
owned by
by
the
the
USS
Fort
Pawnee.
Columbus.
That was
Civil
a
War Naval Museum
Navy
up in
warship
Columbus,
built
Georgia,
from
but
the
seal up
as a
gunboat.
landing.
Again, it was a steam sloop. It had a sail rig, fore and aft, but then again, it also had a
And of
steam
course,
engine.
it served in the South Atlantic Squadron,
mainly off the Carolina coastline, north and South Carolina, but it did see some service in Florida.
It would
This year, it's going to be
Pawnee
September
helped with the
27th,
retaking of
Friday,
Clinch and
28th,
Fernandina.
29th.
And
Friday
actually,
is our
some of her
Sunday.
crew saw
Past
some
2
service
years
on the
we've had
St. John's
700,
River.
800
They were part of that
Come
expedition
visit
that
us.
went up to Lake
This year's a
Monroe.
biggie because this year is the
and the General Sumter.
160th anniversary of the original Union.
There's a very famous picture. There's a deck scene on the Pawnee.
So
it was.
and then I have my
it was
little
about
Navy display there
221 foot
because
plus
it's
in
at the
length.
Bronson House.
That's the historic.
According
museum
to the
back there.
Dictionary of American
St.
Naval
John's River
fighting
is
ships
various
armed with
stones thrown
8
away,
9-inch
so I talk
Dahlgrens
about
from the Union Navy gunboat.
Although in this
Activity
picture
on the
here,
river.
you can see
And along the
6
St.
guns
John's
here.
here,
There probably would have been 6 on the other
port
too.
to any
So,
army
as I understand it, over the course of the war, there was a lot of.
So there's some
gunnery,
websites where I get a lot of
my.
We're sort of gunned up, to be more formidable.
Pictures. A lot of my
And you can
pictures
see
either
that
came
the
from
guys on the deck,
Florida Memory
Project,
where
the
Department of
State,
State,
or
deck
from the Naval
working
History
deck
and
uniform
Heritage
of a
Man,
Union Navy sailor, the blue jumper, the blue trousers, and as Bob said, I've been kind of getting into World War II because I'm.
And again, most of the guys in this unit are Marines.
Work on the war
I'm
currently
their only sailor,
although sometimes a couple other guys
Navy
fall in with
Historical
us.
Association.
But so
has
again,
down
we
here in
portray
Jacksonville. So
a
there's
naval
the
landing
working
party,
dungarees and
uniform,
sailors. There's
this is
just
quarters.
that
I
little
found
natural
a company that
that's where
makes
I'll be
the
going.
period accurate K-pop vets.
And I guess it's
And
just
there's
like in the real military, a lot of
combat.
reenactment stuff is just.
And then the other thing I'm proud of,
They're
is,
ready for you to go
I
into
got
action.
sworn into the Coast Guard Auxiliary, so I'm a volunteer coastie now.
And so
I'm
this is
working on
an event that,
becoming
again,
a-
unfortunately, no
it's called
longer
an
occurs.
ATON
It's
verifier.
dropped.
That's
So
aids
this
to
was
navigation.
at,
Buoys,
St. Andrews Bay
channel
Salt
markers
Works
and all,
raid
they
event,
have
where we
to be
actually
inspected regularly
reenacted
by a
certified
raid
raid
on
on a
a
Confederate salt works.
towards the end of the war.
We went up
The
to
launches, which
Naval Station
formerly
Coast Guard
powered
Station
by
Mayport,
oar by sailors,
back in
actually had
December
a
to
steam
kind of
engine
meet some of
mounted
the
in
regular
the
staff.
steam launch by the end of the war. This is actually
So
owned
that's
by
it.
the Port Columbus Civil War Naval
We
Museum.
haven't
up
answered
in
any
Columbus,
questions.
Georgia.
Yeah, we got
do,
time
an
for
actual
questions. So
beach
I would like,
landing on,
well, number one, the uniform
Bay
you're
and
wearing
work up
now,
the
why
beach
don't
and
you
assault
tell
the,
them
the
when that
salt
was
works.
worn, what rank, or I mean, what?
So this is just.
And of course, I've
I've
talked to some folks, we've got our own little.
You might want to talk.
occupation.
You're
They
Always the
had
last
3
full weekend
grades
of
of
September.
September.
This year it's going to be September 27th.
You
That's
were
Friday,
classified
28th.
rated
Fridays are
as a
school day.
landsman.
Past 2 years,
And
we've had
typically it would take you
700
about 2
fourth
years
graders
of actual
come visit us.
Go through a little bit of
This
basic
year's a biggie because
most
this
year
year
is
is
the
the actual board
160th
ship
anniversary
of
of
the
the
original
patient of
if you had or you acquired
2 years of
So,
experience aboard ship.
and then I
learn
have
some of the basic skills
there
because
then you would be
at the Bronson classified as an
That's
ordinary
the
seaman.
historic
And
museum back
with
there.
additional experience
St. John's
in
River is
adapting
very
some specialized
throw
skills,
away,
so
so
I
I
talk
talk
about
about
the
the
Union Navy
So
gunboat.
that was the
activity
first
on
kind of
river.
level of
And
enlistment.
along the St.
Then the
John's,
second
the
level
Navy
of enlistment was
gave
the
a
petty
tremendous
officers.
amount of support to
In
any
the
army
in
activities
the
along the
Army,
river. You got your sergeants and your corporals.
So
called
there's some
non-commissioned
websites where I get
officers.
a
They
lot
don't
of my
call
information.
petty officers, non-commissioned officers.
Pictures, a lot of my pictures
Navy
either
very
came from
contrary.
the
petty
Florida
officer
Memory
would be
Project,
similar
the Department
to
of
a
State,
sergeant or a corporal.
or from
They would
the
be in
Naval
charge
History
of a
Heritage
group of men,
Museum,
just kind of
doing some kind of special
website.
site.
And
And as Bob said, I've been kind
I
of
do have another chamber with
still have to make my way
with
up
the
there,
petty
but I liked
officer's
it.
rate
Do a
patch.
little docent work
The
on
petty
the
officer
Bullet,
rate
which is
structure in the
that
Civil
Navy
War was
Square,
very
that,
much simpler
the
than what it is
Navy
today.
Strike
Today you've got
Association
petty officer
has
first
down there
class,
in
petty
Jacksonville.
officer.
So there's the
Petty officer
with the
third
dungaree
class
uniform.
That's what you get rated
There's
at
general
first.
quarters. I found a
petty
company
officer
that makes
second
the
class,
period
then
accurate
petty officer
K-pop
first
and
class.
life vets,
And then from
and then
there
there's
you go
the
chief.
M1 combat
Chief petty
cadet.
officer, senior chief.
And then the other thing
master
I'm kind
chief.
of
None of
proud
those
of is,
existed
I
during the
got
Civil
sworn
War.
into
They
the,
just
Coast
they
Guard
had some of the
Auxiliary,
same
so I'm
volunteer
ratings
postings
that they do
now.
today.
Working on
Those
becoming
make
gunners
a,
mate, what's called an some of the
ATON
others.
verifier.
And
That's
basically
aids to navigation.
some of the petty
channel
officer
markers
ratings
and all
had
that
to have to
have
be
to,
inspected regularly by
insignia on their
certified
right
people.
sleeve.
So I'm working
Some of
on
them
my
had it on their
left certification.
And
Bosun's
we
mate,
went up
gunner's
to,
mate, that was right
Naval
sleeve.
Station of Coast Guard Station
Quartermaster, which is
Mayport,
what I portray, so my
back
my
in
pro
December
is
to
on
kind of meet some of the
my
regular
left
staff
sleeve.
there.
And I guess you just kind of knew what
So
his
that's
rating
it.
was by where he was on the ship and what
We
he was
haven't
doing.
answered any questions.
Yeah,
And
we
then
got,
there were
we got
some
time for
ratings
questions,
that
but
no
I would
longer
like,
exist.
well, number one, the
Captain
uniform
of
you're
the
wearing
tops.
now,
Each
why don't you
mast
tell
had a
them?
petty
when that
officer in
was
charge
worn,
of it.
right?
He would supervise the
So
men
this is
who would
just
go
your
up
basic
the
seaman.
mast to burn the sails.
Had
But you know,
you
we
might
don't
wanna
have sails
talk
anymore, so they don't
Yeah,
have.
You're on.
They had 3 grades
So,
of steam.
and then,
Of course, then you got your
absolutely
commissioned
no
officers,
experience.
who were very different. You were classified or rated.
And they would
as a
be,
landsman. And typically it would take you
towards
about
the end
2
of the war,
years
you had
of
your
actual,
ensign,
you know, you
your
go through a little bit
master,
of basic tenant. Most of your training was commander
aboard ship,
serving as an
and
active duty seaman. Those were
Um,
your commissioned officers.
if you
had or you
you,
acquired
would
2 years
command
of
the,
experience
the
aboard
warships.
ships, learn some of the
So,
basic skills.
but
So I'm just
then you
wearing
would
your
be,
basic seaman classified as an ordinary
I don't
seaman.
have the pro.
And
on either
with
sleeve.
additional
Again,
experience
it's
and
a
jumper,
jumper,
some specialized skills, then you would be
with
the
the
flap
able
on the
seaman.
back.
So
That was the first kind of
and-
level
and
of
trousers.
enlisted. Then the second level of enlisted was the petty officers.
Yeah,
But this is called a fall front, that's your sergeants and your corporals,
Yeah.
called non-commissioned officers, they don't
and
call petty
when
officers.
the
non-commissioned
sailor was
officers
issued
in the
this
Navy.
stuff,
Navy's very
I get you.
contrary. But
Um,
petty officers
basically
would
all
be
it was
similar
was just a
to a sergeant or a corporal. They would be in charge of a
So
group
what
of
they
men,
would do,
doing
doing
overtime
some
in
kind
their
of
downtime,
specialty
is
is
they would, you know, do
if I were
embroidery
a petty
on
officer,
it.
sometimes
I
they
do
would
have
just
another
embroider along
chamber
the seams,
with,
you know,
with the
white
petty
contrasting
officer's
color,
rate patch.
The petty officer on the back there, basically to show much simpler than what it is today. Today, you've got petty officer. Sailoring back then was not a
Petty officer
respected
third
profession.
class is
It's
lower.
very good rated at first. So it really
And
attracted
petty officer
a lower
second
caliber
class,
of man.
then petty officer
Some of
first
whom
class.
spent their time
And
making
then
a
from
living
there,
on the
you go
other
chief.
side of the law.
Chief
Petty
petty
sailors
officer
could be
senior
notorious
chief,
chiefs,
so,
master chiefs.
new guys
None of those
came in,
existed.
during
He didn't
the
watch
Civil
his
War.
new
They just-
clothes. They had some of the
gone,
same
and he just
ratings
had
we do
ratty clothes
today.
that both
Somebody else is wearing for some of the others. And basically,
they try to personalize their
some of the petty
stuff,
officer
so
ratings
we
had
get
the,
filched.
and it just gave them something
Insignia
to do on
in
their
their
right
off
sleeve.
hours.
Some of them had it on their left sleeve. Let me go back here. Bosun's mate, gunner's mate, that was right
Yeah,
sleeve.
so.
Quartermaster, which is what I portray, so my pro is on
Never thought about it
my
till
left
now,
sleeve.
you know, they're very
And yeah, I guess you just kind of knew what his
Clark
rating
Gable
was,
was,
you know,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that was
Well,
on the ship and what he was doing. Yeah, and then there were some ratings that no longer exist, like captain of the tops. You know, each mast had a petty officer in charge of it. He would supervise the men who would go up the mast to work the sails. But, you know, we don't have sails anymore, so you don't have any good questions. And actually, over the past year and then you've got your commissioned officers.
Now,
We're very the first thing the Union Navy tried to do was and they would be, because back towards the end of the war, you had Navy still paid master, your prize money. And so the ship, commander, blockade runner, captain, and they would put some of their crew aboard the runner, and you would go to a court to command the naval court, which would assign a value to the ship itself and its cargo. Half of that value went into a fund that paid pensions to slap on the back Navy sailors wounded in combat, and the other half was paid to the ship that captured it. Now, most of that would go to the this is called a fall front or broad quarter of that was distributed amongst the sailors. And a ship when the sailor was issued his stuff, you know, a sailor was paid $13. Basically, all it was just get a blue jersey with 4 or 5 or no adornment. So what they would do over time in their downtime is they would first they would try to capture. Sometimes they would just if they couldn't, then they would sink them or burn them. Usually allowing the crew to escape. Put something on the back there. I don't know basically to show that how many that individuals were captured or sailoring back then was not the respected profession. The numbers of blockade runners that tried to get really attracted lower caliber of men that were captured. Some of whom spent their time making a living on the other side of the law. And the one interesting one book that I read, so you know, if a new guy came in, he didn't watch his. Although the number of runners trying to get through got ratio less, as you know, somebody else had been wearing, they were more successful in terms of percentage. They tried to personalize there because they were these very fast, steam-powered, and it just gave them something to do ships that had a very low profile. Now, let me go back to here, gray or black or camouflage, and they would get in at night. So they would just run their way through the blockade.
Never thought about it.
So,
till now, you know,
although
they're
the numbers, you know, at first the numbers of blockade.
Clark Gable,
you know, yeah, but the percentage getting through wasn't real high. The numbers as the war progressed went down, but that percentage getting through successfully kind of went up because, you know, the captains were much more experienced. They were using much more sophisticated ships to get through.
Were they captured at month or anything like that?
Okay, good question. And actually, over the past year and a half, 2 very good books have come out. Now, the first thing the Union Navy tried to do was capture no, not in the Civil War. Because back then, World War II, the Navy still paid what was called prize money. So the ship that captured a blockade runner, you know, they would put some of their crew aboard the runner, and the sailors would fight. Just like this, you know, no naval port here, which would assign a value to the ship itself and its cargo. You know, if they could swim that, maybe they could value went into a lot of sailors that paid pensions to they would grab wounded in combat. You know, the other half was paid to the ship that captured it. Now, most of that would go to commissioned officers of the ship. But a quarter of that was distributed among the sailors, and a ship real successful in capturing, you know, like Trafalgar sailor was paid $13 a month, and going up against another. A lot of it was $5 or $6 a month, which is like the Columbine up the river supplement to his pay. So first they would try to capture. You know, there was if they couldn't, then they would sink them or burn them. Usually allowing the crew for their sailing ship. There was an ambush. I don't know that there's any statistics on how many
individuals were captured or killed or whatever.
other than
There
some
are
of the
some ironclad battles, of course, like the numbers of blockade runners that tried to get through, that made it when the Confederate raider captured and converted USS Kearsarge. And one interesting book that I read, I was a ship-to-ship engagement, and the Alabama was sunk. Although the number of runners trying to get through got less and less as the war went on, but no, the sailors were more successful in terms of percentage that got through. Because they were these very fast, steam-powered, side-wheel, steam-powered ships that had a very low profile. There were lots of injuries, painted gray or black or camouflage, and they would get in at night and that kind of. So they would just run their way through the blockade, and that. So although the numbers, at first the numbers of blockade runners went up, but the percentage getting through wasn't real high. The numbers as the war progressed went down, but that percentage getting through, the main successfully kind of went up because it was much more effective. Captains were much more experienced. They were using much more sophisticated. That was their first choice, was to use coal, but then they had to have stations where they could get the coal supply. They could use wood, but it was much less efficient as a fuel, than coal. No, not in the Civil War. That's I've World War II. We're outfitted like naval officers group last week. Last year I did a presentation. They grabbed that Cape Hawk. That's what they asked. No, the sailors would fight, and that's actually no protective gear or there's a master's thesis or a PhD in how the Union if they could swim. Maybe it's almost like I think there were two sailors. There was the warships of the blockade. They would grab, and then there was loading wood, or merchant ships and colliers, coal carrying ships, and all something like that. But the interesting thing was there really were very few ammunition and coal. That was the reason that the Union Navy did no real fleet supplemental bases, like Trafalgar, Nelson, main base, two main bases here going up against Port Royal, South Carolina. Was Key West, like the always made up the rivers, but then they also took in my more broad Fernandina. There were Mayport Mills, Union watering over on the Gulf Coast. They took Acon to get fresh water for their sailing ships. There was an ambush on the Waccasas River, and these were kind of where they weren't supposed secondary bases where they would have coal. Other than some of the ironclad battles, of course, like the Monitor and the logistics of the blockade. I think at the time when the Confederate raider, largest logistical operation USS Kearsarge ever attempted, probably the only time I was again was a ship engagement in the Alabama Pacific War. They're really interesting. Very few actual. So, but a lot of the. But no, the sailors fought just like this. If it was hot, the logistics of the blockade. That's totally on this. Just to like again, there's a master's thesis or a PhD. No protection whatsoever, and there were lots of injuries. Splinter injuries.
Artillery? Were they shooting exploding cannonballs, or are they just big iron balls?
That was again one of the advances of the Civil War. They shot solid shots, so they were still doing that. But then they had exploding shell that was a shell packed with powder. And would have a main fuel used was coal because it was much more effective. Shell would be in the air, and both sides. That was our first choice. Was coal. Shot. They had to have stations and get the coal supply. They could use wood, but it was either the much less efficient, caused a lot of injuries, as it hit the wood and burst, or again the masonry fort, the shells just blasted into rubble. That's when I talked to the gunners really liked last week, and last year I did because they could skip it off the water accurately, and that's what they asked. The ship was the shells because they were fired. That's actually untapped. When they hit the water, they would. There's a master's thesis or a PhD in how the Union Navy supplied the blockade. It's almost like I think there were two fleets. There was the warships of the blockading fleet, and then there was the fleets of merchant ships and colliers, coal carrying ships, and all that kept these ships supplied with water and food. I've been asked that. That was the reason that the Union Navy did take these supplemental bases. I've been trying here in the South. Their main base, two main bases here were Port Royal, South Carolina, and Key West, Florida, which always got everybody hands. But then they also took everybody. Fernandina, he wrote a series, fictional series about they took Mayport out to Tampa Bay. The reason I got into that series was because his first and these were kind of secondary bases where they would have coal stored. Schooner captains up in New England And then two of his brothers were drafted. I think he enlisted in the Navy to avoid the draft. Largest logistical operation. He was stationed with the ever attempted. Probably the only time they did it again. So yeah, the first three novels were in the Pacific War. His accomplishments were such that he was one of the. So, but yeah, a lot of the naval officers in the war were called volunteer. The logistics of the blockade. That's with command experience on the merchant. There's a master's thesis. The Navy, the blockade. They needed guys so much that
What kind of
they would just, take the merchant officers, just give them a short course in naval
just big
protocol,
iron
and
balls?
put them in command. That was again one of the advantages. These guys of the war, volunteer officers, usually they were still doing that. But then they had exploding head commander. That's a volunteer officer. Shells. Most of them after the war have a few that the artillery occupation estimate how long real high performers were actually given a regular commission. Cut the fuse to that Navy. It would be ignited was one of those shot shell. And then the whole series is a very well written verse. He finds himself shrapnel could cause a lot of injuries. Usually surreptitiously at some of the more again the masonry force in naval history. He was at the first battle of Ocean Ironclads. Interesting enough, what's called the gunners really liked it between Chilean because they could skip it off. He was aboard the Russian fleet and they engaged Japanese shells because they were fired from a rifle gun. So he finds the water. They would he was at some odd direction harbor. During the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. Navy, bombarded the Spanish fleet, and so he finds himself in all these. There you go, one more perspective, and come back. In the last book, he passed away after a long career, but I guess I hope I'm not doing spoiler alert. But I've been asked that, and I haven't been able to find out. Why continues by his son went into the Navy. I've been trying, and his sons went into the Navy, and so it was a Navy family. Many went to the academy at Annapolis, and so I've got every book. His last book with chapters of every book. He wrote a series, a fictional series about a naval officer, Peter Wake. The reason I got into that series was called the Honor Series. Books are set in the Civil War. Wake and his family were schooner captains up in New England.
I mean, because they're not.
And then two of his brothers were drafted. He enlisted in the Navy to avoid the draft about the middle of the war. And Charleston was stationed with the East Fleet because Charleston was West. So yeah, the first three novels were in the war. St. John's at any one time probably only had a couple of them. He was, a lot of the naval officers in the war, and they would volunteer, wouldn't be just sitting there. They guys with command experience because they would have a sector that they would, the Navy, the blockade. So no, it was not so much that, as I mentioned earlier, they would just take the merchant officers, just give them a short course in naval of ships, and put them in command of their naval vessel. These guys were volunteer officers. Usually, if you see the name,
I guess it would change up
lieutenant, commander, that's a volunteer officer. Yeah, and then after the war, they just went back to their former occupations. But a few of the real high performers were actually given a regular commission, and sometimes again, Peter Wake was one of those. So you had sort of the whole series is multi-tiered, very well written. The big ships, he finds himself trying to catch them as they were coming in, usually surreptitiously at some of the more significant events, smaller, shallower drafts. He was at the first battle of Ocean, the ferry boats, even during what's called the Battle of the Pacific between the Chilean, right there by the entrance to the harbor. He was aboard the Russian fleet when they engaged the Japanese fleet at Tsushima in 1905. So he finds himself in the middle of, he was at in Havana Harbor during the Spanish-American War when the U.S. Navy, bombarded the Spanish fleet. And so he finds himself in all these places. And yeah, in the last book, he does pass away after a long career, but I guess I hope I'm not doing spoiler alert. Macomber continues by his son went into the Navy and his sons went into the Navy. And so it was a Navy family. Many went to the academy at Annapolis. And so Macomber concludes his last book with chapters of how some of Peter Wake's sons did in the Navy.
All the books have honor in the title.
Yeah, it's called the Honor Series. Yeah.
When you talk about the blockade, can you tell us how far apart were these ships? I mean, because they're not. I think of a blockade as just like a line of ships, but obviously they're not. They're not ships to do that.
Charleston Harbor had a pretty good fleet off it because Charleston was Charleston, it's just succession, that kind of thing. St. John's at any one time probably only had a couple of gunboats, stationed out in Mayport. And they wouldn't be just sitting there, they would have to be patrolling because they would have a sector that they were responsible for.
Okay.
So no, it was not, as I mentioned earlier to her question, it was not, this wall of ships, there were holes that hunters could exploit.
Did they change, and I guess they would change up their schedules kind of, because I mean, obviously if you did the same thing every week, you knew what to expect.
Yeah, I'm sure they tried maybe to kind of keep things varied, yeah. And, sometimes, again, particularly some of the larger ports, you had sort of a multi-tiered blockade. The big ships would be offshore, try to catch them as they were coming in. And then maybe you'd either have a middle or an inshore group with smaller, shallower draft ships like the Columbine or the ferry boats, or even sailing vessels like schooners and such, who would be right there by the entrance to the harbor or by the river mouth or something like that.
Yeah.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Rob.